The room went dead silent when she pulled the suture thread through. 3 months. That's how long Rachel Torres had been volunteering at Crossroads Church's community health clinic in Houston before Pastor Dr. Hargrove decided she was a problem. The clinic smelled of donated antiseptic and something older, old hymnals, maybe, or the particular mustiness that comes from a room that serves 2 purposes and neither one perfectly. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same lights that illuminated Sunday school lessons on Tuesday mornings when the exam rooms transformed back into classrooms. Rachel moved through the space with the kind of quiet efficiency that most people didn't notice, and that was exactly how she preferred it. She restocked the suture trays at 6:11 a.m., before the clinic opened, her hands moving through the familiar ritual without hesitation. Nylon, silk, monofilament, absorbable. The instruments arranged by size and material like a surgeon arranging thoughts before a difficult conversation. Her right leg carried a slight limp on days when the humidity climbed, a detail she attributed to an old sports injury if anyone asked. No one ever asked. The pair of worn combat boots sat in her car trunk, Baghdad dust still visible in the treads where it had dried into the rubber. She hadn't touched them in 4 years. The military had been very clear, Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres was officially dead. The records had been expunged. The medals buried in a vault at Fort Meade. Her name removed from every official registry except the ones locked behind classified server protocols. In exchange for disappearing completely, for never surfacing in any official capacity, for living a life where no one knew her real name or her real service, she got to keep breathing. The deal had seemed reasonable at the time. Now it felt like wearing a borrowed body. The clinic's morning light filtered through windows that faced the parking lot, and Rachel had just finished organizing the 3rd suture tray when Pastor Dr. Hargrove entered the break room. He was a man built entirely of presumption, tall enough to make people look up, confident enough that people usually kept looking. His white coat bore the title Medical Director embroidered in gold thread, a position he'd earned through board connections rather than any particular medical competence. He held a cup of coffee from the expensive place on the corner, the kind of coffee that cost $8 and demonstrated your access to certain types of resources. When he saw Rachel, he paused. She didn't look up. She was rewrapping a tray of 4.0 silk with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before, maybe more. Her hands moved with a kind of muscle memory that didn't belong in a community clinic in a church basement. Hargrove watched the way her fingers positioned each instrument. The spacing. The alignment. The absolute absence of hesitation. A competent nurse would know the proper tray arrangement. An exceptional nurse would follow protocol. But Rachel wasn't following protocol. She was organizing the instruments according to a system that made surgical sense, the logic of someone who'd prepared trays under pressure, under circumstances where the wrong reach could cost seconds and seconds could cost lives. His jaw tightened slightly, just enough that someone watching would have caught it. He set his coffee down on the counter and left without speaking. By 9:15 a.m., the waiting room had begun to fill. The clinic served Houston's underinsured population, people who needed healthcare but couldn't afford the price of admission anywhere else. A homeless veteran named Marcus Webb sat in the plastic chair nearest the intake desk, his daughter beside him. The daughter was maybe 30, with the careful posture of someone whose parent had made life harder than it needed to be but whom she loved anyway. Marcus's left foot was swollen red, the skin around it hot and angry, the kind of infection that starts in the street and spreads like gossip. He'd been living in his truck for 7 months since the VA's housing program fell through some bureaucratic crack nobody had bothered to fill in again. Rachel was assigned to the exam room, and when she saw Marcus's foot, something in her face didn't change, but something in her hands did. She moved to the supply cabinet and returned with materials that weren't on the standard protocol list, antiseptic that was stronger than what the clinic usually stocked, sterile field supplies organized for something more intensive than the clinic's usual minor wound care, the kind of equipment you'd use if you were planning to go deep into a systemic infection. She didn't ask permission. She didn't consult the protocol manual taped to the wall. She simply began, her movements economical and precise, each motion flowing into the next like a dance performed in operating theaters in countries that still had bullet holes in the walls. "This is going to hurt," she said to Marcus, and there was something in her voice, not sympathy, but something deeper, the kind of calm that comes from having already decided that pain was information and information was survival. She began debriding the infected tissue with a kind of focus that made the room disappear. Her daughter watched, transfixed, as Rachel's hands moved through the wound with surgical precision, removing the dead tissue, exposing the healthy pink underneath, working with the concentrated intensity of someone who'd learned to make these decisions under circumstances that didn't allow for hesitation or second-guessing. The infection was deeper than it looked. 3 centimeters down. 4. She found the source, a piece of something embedded in the subcutaneous tissue, maybe a nail fragment, maybe something else. She removed it carefully, held it up to the light without comment, then disposed of it. The bleeding was controlled. The irrigation was meticulous. By the time she finished, Marcus's foot was cleaned in a way that would actually heal, and his daughter was crying quietly in the corner. "You saved his foot," the daughter said, her voice small in the fluorescent silence. Rachel was already documenting what she'd done, her handwriting precise and clinical. She didn't respond to the compliment. She never did. That's when Pastor Dr. Hargrove appeared in the exam room doorway. His timing suggested he'd been waiting, watching through the small window in the door, measuring the moment until Rachel finished. His smile was the kind that doesn't involve the eyes, the kind that's a weapon disguised as politeness. Behind him, 2 other nurses from the clinic staff lingered in the hallway, their posture suggesting they'd been summoned. "Rachel," he said, and the way he said her name made it sound like an accusation. "A word about protocol." She straightened. Her hands moved to her sides. Her face remained absolutely neutral, the kind of composure that comes from having stood at attention in front of superior officers while receiving news about things that couldn't be discussed. She was still wearing gloves, sterile ones, contaminated now by the conversation he was about to have. "What you just performed," Hargrove continued, his voice pitched to carry into the waiting room, "exceeds your scope of practice as a temporary nursing volunteer. The protocol for infected wounds requires immediate physician referral, not independent treatment." He paused, letting the words settle. "I'm concerned about your credentials. Your background is somewhat unclear. Where exactly did you receive your nursing certification?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The 2 nurses in the hallway shifted their weight. Marcus and his daughter watched. Rachel pulled off her gloves with a single smooth motion, one glove, then the other, the sound of latex snapping against itself like a period at the end of a sentence. When she looked at Hargrove, her eyes were empty of everything except a kind of exhausted recognition, the look of someone who'd seen this play before in different uniforms, different buildings, different continents. "The wound was infected," she said quietly. "The standard protocol would have resulted in tissue loss. Possibly amputation." Her voice had a flatness to it, the kind of flatness that comes from choosing words very carefully. "I treated the infection using established field medical techniques. The patient's outcome is superior to protocol." "Your opinion on protocol is exactly the problem," Hargrove said, his voice rising slightly. He was performing now for the hallway audience, for the waiting room beyond, for everyone who might be listening. "We have established procedures for a reason. Credentials exist for a reason. And I don't actually know where you trained, do I? I don't know anything about your background beyond what your temporary agency provided. For all I know, you could be." "I'm a nurse," Rachel interrupted, and the room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent exam room hum its mechanical rhythm. "I've treated infections worse than this in environments you couldn't imagine. The patient will keep his foot. That's what matters." Hargrove's face flushed slightly, the color rising from his neck. He wasn't used to being challenged, and he certainly wasn't used to being challenged by someone in scrubs in front of an audience. He turned to address the hallway, raising his voice further. "I'm posting a formal notice regarding scope of practice violations," he announced. "Anyone engaging in treatment beyond their certification level will face disciplinary action. We have protocols. We follow them. This is a community clinic, not a military field hospital." He paused, seeming to enjoy the word militaries as it left his mouth, as if he'd caught Rachel in something. "I expect everyone to understand the difference." Then he left, his white coat flaring slightly as he turned, and the hallway cleared immediately. The other two nurses disappeared without meeting Rachel's eyes. Marcus's daughter looked like she wanted to say something, but Rachel was already moving past them, stripping off her gloves, washing her hands at the sink with water that was far too hot. The soap smelled like lavender. Everything about this life was supposed to be gentle, gentle jobs, gentle places, gentle hands. Nothing about her hands was gentle. Her hands were the hands of someone who'd held lives together while mortar rounds landed in the courtyard outside. Her hands were the hands of a senior chief petty officer, and those hands didn't belong in a church basement in Houston, and everyone in the clinic had just been reminded of that fact. That afternoon, an Army Ranger medic named Marcus Chen arrived at the clinic for a volunteer shift. He worked with the Veterans Outreach Program, the one that tried to connect homeless vets with services they'd earned and then been denied. He was scanning the patient logs when he saw Rachel's name documented on Marcus Webb's treatment. He read through her notes with the expression of someone reading something in a language he almost understood. The documentation was military in its precision. The treatment decisions were military in their logic. The confidence in her handwriting was military in its complete absence of doubt. When Rachel passed him in the hallway carrying supplies to restock the procedure trays, he watched the way her body moved, the slight adjustment for her right leg, the economical motion of every gesture, the way she carried herself like someone who'd been trained to occupy as little space as possible. He studied the suture tray she set down on the counter. The arrangement wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was the arrangement of someone who'd prepared instruments for a team, who'd learned which tools needed to be closest to which other tools, whose muscle memory belonged to something far more demanding than a community health clinic. She didn't meet his eyes, but his eyes followed her hands as they moved through the tray with the fluidity of someone performing a ritual she could perform with her eyes closed. The efficiency. The precision. The absolute absence of wasted motion. Marcus Chen had worked with military medical personnel for 7 years. He knew what expertise looked like when it was moving through hospital corridors in borrowed scrubs, trying not to be seen. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 days later. The break room door swung open at 7:15 in the morning, and Rachel Torres set her lunch bag on the counter next to the coffee maker that smelled like burned plastic and regret. 4 staff nurses sat at the table, Sharon, Denise, Kim, and Patricia, each with their own styrofoam cup and a clipboard full of patient assignments for the day. Rachel had worked alongside them for 93 days. She knew Sharon's daughter was applying to UT Austin. She knew Denise had a cat named Mr. Whiskers who required insulin injections twice daily. She knew Patricia had survived breast cancer 2 years ago and still checked her scans obsessively. She didn't know that they'd already been told to leave. Pastor Hargrove had called each of them into his office the previous afternoon. Not together. One by one. He had a gift for that, making you feel like the conversation was uniquely about you, uniquely important, uniquely confidential. To Sharon, he'd expressed concerns about Rachel's unknown background and how liability insurance might be affected if someone with unverified credentials was working in the clinic. To Denise, he'd mentioned that he'd been trying to reach Rachel's previous employers and was having difficulty locating them. To Kim, he'd suggested that Rachel's presence might be creating tension among the volunteer staff and that perhaps they should distance themselves professionally. To Patricia, he'd simply said, "I'm looking into some things. For the clinic's protection, of course." None of them had pushed back. None of them had asked questions. They'd simply absorbed the implication, this woman was a problem, and proximity to the problem was contagious. Rachel pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table. She sat down. She opened her lunch container, turkey sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water. She didn't look up. Sharon was the first to move. She gathered her clipboard, her empty cup, her phone. She stood slowly, as if giving Rachel a chance to notice, to understand, to say something that might change what was about to happen. Rachel cut her sandwich diagonally. Sharon left. The chair scraped against the linoleum floor, deliberately, audibly, like a period at the end of a sentence. Denise followed within 10 seconds. Then Kim. Then Patricia. Patricia paused at the door. Her hand lingered on the frame. Rachel could feel her waiting, could feel the weight of whatever she was about to say. But Patricia had a daughter in high school and a mortgage and a job that paid her bills. She had things to protect. Rachel understood that better than anyone. Nothing personal, honey, Patricia said quietly. But Pastor Hargrove has concerns about your background. We can't risk our licenses. The door closed. Rachel sat alone at a table meant for 6. The fluorescent light overhead flickered twice, then settled into a steady hum that sounded like the beginning of a migraine. She looked down at her sandwich. The turkey was pale. The bread was slightly stale. She'd bought it yesterday, assuming she'd be hungry today. She set it down and pushed the container away. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw clenched once, twice, then released. She picked the sandwich up again and took a bite because that was what you did when you were training for composure. You acted normal until normal became automatic. You chewed and swallowed and breathed like someone who hadn't just been executed by coordinated silence. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened 3 days later. The staff bulletin board hung in the main hallway of Crossroads Church's clinic, next to the patient bathroom and the supply closet where Rachel restocked gauze and trauma shears every morning. It was a corkboard covered in notices, fire evacuation procedures, flu vaccination reminders, a photograph of the volunteer of the month from last June. On Thursday at 4:17 in the afternoon, Hargrove posted a new notice. The header was printed in bold, 18-point font, Rachel Torres, protocol violations and credential questions. Rachel was carrying a box of compression bandages when she saw it. She set the box down on the windowsill. She read the notice. It listed her unauthorized field procedures, her refusal to respect established hierarchy, her unknown background and unverified credentials, and her potential liability to the clinic's insurance coverage. It noted that her nursing school in Nevada had been difficult to verify. It questioned the references she provided. It expressed concern about her mysterious gap in employment history from 2014 to 2019. It concluded with a formal statement that she was indefinitely suspended from volunteer activities pending a full credential review by hospital administration and legal counsel. Hargrove stood in the doorway of his office, watching her read it. He was waiting for something, for her to cry, to defend herself, to beg for mercy. She knew the anatomy of humiliation well enough to recognize when someone was conducting it like surgery. The placement of the notice. The timing. The witnesses. Volunteers were moving through the hallway. A woman with diabetes monitoring paperwork glanced over. A man with a bandaged hand slowed as he walked past. Rachel set the box down on the floor. She turned to face Hargrove across the 30 feet of hallway between them. She didn't walk toward him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let her eyes find his and held them steady. The difference between us, she said, each word shaped like a surgical instrument, is I've actually had to decide who lives and who dies. Then she turned back to the supply closet and continued her work. Her hands moved through the trauma shears and the rolled gauze and the sterile gloves with the precise efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in conditions far worse than a church basement. Not mechanical. Not angry. Just capable. Just steady. The kind of steady that comes from muscle memory older than fear. In the blood donation room next door, Army Ranger Marcus Chen stood to have his arm wrapped by the phlebotomist. He'd heard every word through the open doorway. He watched through the window frame as Rachel's fingers moved through the supply tray, right hand to the gauze, left hand to the compression wraps, both movements synchronized like a dancer's. He watched the way she didn't hurry despite the audience. The way she didn't defend herself. The way she simply returned to the work, as if she'd already endured far worse than the humiliation of a bulletin board. He'd spent 14 years in uniform. He'd seen combat in 4 countries. He knew what competence looked like when it was forged in places that most people only read about. And what he was seeing wasn't a volunteer nurse with credential problems. What he was seeing was something else entirely. Rachel finished restocking before she allowed herself to move toward her car. She didn't cry in the supply closet. She didn't cry in the hallway. She waited until she was alone, keys in hand, and then she did something that would change everything. She drove not home, but to the Veterans Cemetery on the northwest side of Houston, where the rain was beginning to fall like it had a personal vendetta against the city. The sky had turned the color of old bruises. Rain hammered the windshield in sheets thick enough that she had to pull over twice to see the road clearly. By the time she reached the cemetery gates, her shirt was soaked. She didn't bring an umbrella. She didn't have a plan. She just knew where she needed to be. The grave was in Section G, Row 12. Grass was already growing over the marker. That happened faster than it should, the earth was eager to forget. She knelt in the mud, rain running down her neck and soaking into her scrubs, and she pressed her forehead against the cold marble of the headstone. The name was his real name, the one he'd carried before he married her, before he'd become part of her classified life, before Baghdad. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered into the rain. "I tried. I'm trying to stay hidden like they ordered. Like we promised. But I couldn't let that kid die. And now I've failed you. I failed our promise that I'd stay safe." Her hands gripped the wet grass. She didn't allow herself to break apart. That wasn't discipline, that was just human biology reasserting itself. Instead, she knelt there for 7 minutes, breathing in the smell of rain-soaked earth and wet stone, her voice too quiet for anyone else to hear, her words meant only for the man beneath the marker who'd given his life so she could have won. And then she stood up, brushed the mud from her knees, and walked back to her car like someone who'd already died once and knew exactly how to survive the second time around. 3 days passed like any other stretch of Rachel's life now, quiet mornings restocking supplies, afternoons filing paperwork in the clinic's back room while other nurses found reasons to work elsewhere, evenings spent alone in her apartment staring at nothing. The write-up stayed on the bulletin board. Hargrove made sure of that. A reminder. A warning. The kind of thing that made volunteers question whether they were welcome anymore, whether the risk was worth whatever they thought they were helping with. Rachel didn't remove it. She walked past it every shift and said nothing, her face a mask of absolute neutrality, the kind that comes from too many years of compartmentalizing fear, anger, and the weight of decisions that cost lives. Wednesday evening came with the kind of October heat that made Houston feel like it was breathing through a wet cloth. The sanctuary at Crossroads Church filled slowly as the congregation filtered in for the midweek service. Rachel was in the clinic room alphabetizing patient files, a task Hargrove had assigned her specifically because it kept her out of sight, out of reach, out of the way. The fluorescent panel above her head buzzed with a sound like distant electricity, and she moved through the filing with the mechanical precision of someone whose hands knew what to do even when her mind had checked out. She could hear the murmur of voices from the sanctuary through the thin walls. The organ music started, that familiar opening hymn. She kept organizing files. Marcus Chen sat in the third pew with his 10-year-old daughter Emma tucked against his side, her small frame wrapped in a yellow dress that made her look impossibly young and fragile. He'd been thinking about Rachel Torres all week, about the way her hands moved through the suture tray with the fluid confidence of someone who'd made peace with operating in crisis. He didn't know her well, just that one moment in the exam room when she'd looked at a homeless veteran's infected wound and made a decision that saved a foot he was pretty sure the hospital would have recommended amputating. That kind of efficiency couldn't be faked. That came from somewhere deep. He'd served 3 tours in Baghdad with the 75th Ranger Regiment, had seen combat medics work in conditions that would have broken people with half her composure. He recognized the signature. The way she moved like she'd already accepted the worst outcome and was simply preventing it through sheer technical competence. Emma was fidgeting with the hymnal, drawing little pictures in the bulletin margins while Hargrove led the service from the front, his voice carrying that particular cadence of absolute certainty that made Rachel's jaw tighten whenever she heard it from the clinic. Marcus wasn't really listening to the sermon. He was thinking about the rib fracture he'd been ignoring for weeks, an old rugby injury from before the military that had never quite healed right, just a dull ache he'd gotten used to, the kind of chronic pain that became part of your baseline and stopped feeling like a warning. The fluorescent lights of the sanctuary hummed overhead, and the air conditioning struggled against the Houston heat, pressing against the windows like something alive and patient. The collapse happened without warning. One moment Marcus was sitting there, Emma beside him, Hargrove's voice droning on about faith and perseverance, and the next moment his chest seized a sharp, tearing sensation like something fundamental shifting inside his ribcage. His rib, the fractured one, had finally surrendered to gravity and time. The bone had moved enough to puncture the pleural membrane. Air was flooding into his chest cavity now, filling the space where his lung needed to expand. His heart was being compressed, shoved sideways by physics and trauma, and he had maybe 4 minutes of useful consciousness left before the pressure would stop it altogether. He fell forward into the pew in front of him with the kind of suddenness that made everyone freeze. His body went rigid, then slack. Emma screamed, that pure, terrified sound of a child watching their world collapse without understanding why. "Daddy!" Her voice cut through the organ music like a knife, and Hargrove turned mid-sentence, his hand still raised mid-gesture, caught between the pulpit and the reality that something had just broken. Someone yelled for 911. Someone else was already dialing. The congregation erupted into that specific chaos of panic and helplessness, people standing, moving toward Marcus, away from him, uncertain what they were supposed to do except witness. Hargrove rushed down from the pulpit with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing, which he absolutely did not. In the clinic room, Rachel heard Emma scream and her hands stopped moving. That particular pitch of terror carries information. It travels through walls and down hallways and hits a part of the brain that doesn't need language to understand. She moved. Not walked. Moved. The filing cabinet was still open behind her. Patient records scattered. She was through the clinic door and into the hallway before her conscious mind had finished processing what she'd heard, her feet moving through muscle memory that predated her cover identity by a decade. The sanctuary entrance was maybe 30 feet away. She covered it in under 4 seconds. Marcus was on his back now, his daughter sobbing beside him, his lips the color of a bruise. The neck vein stood out like cables beneath his skin, that distended, obvious sign of a thorax pressurizing, crushing everything inside it. His chest was barely moving, just that shallow, ineffectual gasping of someone whose lungs had forgotten how to expand. Rachel saw it all in approximately 1 second, the collapsed left side of his chest, the skin pulling in around the ribs like the space was being sucked inward, the cyanosis spreading across his face. Tension pneumothorax. The air that was supposed to be outside his body was crushing his lung and his heart. Every second she stood still was another second his myocardium was being compressed. Hargrove was already kneeling, his hand at Marcus's neck in a position that suggested he was feeling for a pulse he wouldn't recognize if it bit him. "Everyone stay back," he announced, his voice carrying that particular authority of someone who'd taken one first aid class in 1997. "The ambulance is coming. We wait for professionals. Nobody touches this man. It's protocol." Rachel pushed past him, her movement so direct that Hargrove actually stumbled backward. Her eyes were on Marcus's chest, on the distended abdomen, on the way his body was trying to breathe through machinery that wasn't working. She was already reaching into her scrub pocket where she kept the small trauma shears, just old habits, equipment she'd never actually removed after the military quietly ordered her to disappear. Hargrove's hand grabbed her arm before she touched the fabric of Marcus's shirt. His grip was firm, the grip of a man who'd spent decades in positions of institutional power and therefore believed that institutional power was the same thing as actual authority. "Miss Torres, step away from this man immediately." His voice had that particular tone, the one that suggested he'd already won because he was the one in charge. "You are not authorized to provide emergency care at this church. I forbid it." Rachel's eyes moved to Emma, to the girl's face, to the way she was screaming without sound anymore, that kind of terror that had moved past noise into something purely neurological. Then she looked at Marcus's blue lips, the way his body was suffocating while still technically breathing. Her training calculated the timeline like a ticking clock, ambulance minimum 8 minutes out from Houston fire dispatch, maybe 6 if they were close. Marcus had less than 4 minutes of usable oxygen left before his heart would simply stop. The math was absolute. "You need to let me help him," Rachel said. Her voice had dropped an octave from her normal tone, that shift that happens when someone stops trying to fit into a role and starts operating from something deeper. Hargrove's grip tightened. He actually pulled her backward, away from the dying man. "If you touch him, I will have you arrested. I will call the police and report you for practicing medicine without a license. Your little background has been flagged, you understand? I know people in the medical board. One move and I make sure every agency that needs to know about your history finds out about it tonight." He was already pulling his phone from his pocket with his free hand, his face flushed with the kind of righteous certainty that comes from having already decided how this story ends. Around them, the congregation had gone very still, not silent, but still in that way that suggests everyone has stopped breathing simultaneously. Even Emma had stopped screaming. The organ had gone quiet. The only sound was Marcus's thin, desperate gasping and the plastic shell of Hargrove's phone being retrieved from his jacket. "This is your last warning, Miss Torres. Step away or I will destroy you." Rachel Torres looked at this man who'd spent 3 months trying to erase her, and then she looked at Emma, at Marcus's blue lips, at the way the air itself seemed to have gone still and waiting. She thought about her husband's grave, about the rain on cold marble, about the promise she'd made to stay hidden. She thought about 23 years of military service, of Baghdad, of the weight of decisions that meant someone lived or someone died. And she thought about the difference between rules that protected people and rules that protected power. She did not pull away. She didn't pull away. She tore her arm from Hargrove's grip like breaking free from chains. The movement was fluid, economical, without hesitation. Her shoulder rotated backward, a pivot he wasn't prepared for, and his hand slipped across her wet scrub sleeve. He stumbled forward, his voice rising to a shriek, "You will stop this right now. An ambulance is en route. Do not touch him." Rachel was already moving toward the church office. 30 feet. Her boots didn't echo on the carpet, she moved like someone who'd learned to walk silently through hostile territory. Behind her, Marcus's daughter Emma was sobbing, her small hands pressed against her father's chest where each breath came in shallow, panic gasps. The congregation had frozen into a tableau of horror. 200 witnesses. 200 phones, some already recording. The church office smelled like old paper and furniture polish. Rachel's hands were steady as she yanked open the desk drawer, muscle memory taking over, the part of her that had been trained for exactly this kind of emergency. A ballpoint pen sat in a cup next to a worn leather Bible. She grabbed it, her fingers moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before, had done this in the back of a burning convoy while rounds snapped past her head and men screamed her name. Hand sanitizer. She spotted the blue bottle on the shelf above the sink. She was already running, already disassembling the pen as she moved, tearing apart the plastic body with her teeth and fingers. The ink cartridge dropped. The metal tip clattered into the small aluminum waste bin with a sound like a surgical instrument hitting a steel tray. Back through the sanctuary. 47 seconds since Marcus collapsed. Hargrove was still screaming, his face the color of raw meat, his phone held high like a weapon. "Everyone is witnessing this. Criminal assault. I'm calling the police." Rachel dropped to her knees beside Marcus. His chest was caved inward, the left side barely moving. His lips were blue. His eyes were rolling back, oxygen deprivation flooding his neural pathways, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. Emma grabbed Rachel's shoulder. "Please. Please, please, please." Rachel's hands moved on their own. She poured hand sanitizer over her palms, over the hollow plastic tube. Her fingers found the anatomical landmarks, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the same spot between Marcus's ribs where she'd inserted a 14-gauge needle for 17 other soldiers in Baghdad, in a surgical tent that smelled like copper and smoke and diesel exhaust. Pain is information. Every detail mattered. Every tremor was data. "Do not touch him." Hargrove's voice cracked like breaking glass. He lunged forward but stopped short, some part of his mind calculating lawsuits and liability. He recorded instead, his phone steady despite his fury. Everyone see this. Everyone see what she's doing. Rachel's fingers positioned the hollow pen tip against Marcus's ribs. She could feel the intercostal muscle beneath, the cartilage, the space where trapped air was suffocating him. Her breath came steady and deep. Not shallow. Not panicked. The breath of someone who had breathed through worse. She pressed. Twisted. Inserted with controlled force. The hiss came instantly. A sound like air escaping a tire, like a pressure valve opening, like relief itself had a physical noise. Marcus's entire body jerked, and then, his chest expanded. Sudden. Dramatic. His ribs lifted as his left lung reinflated, as oxygen began flowing where it had been blocked by a tension pushing against his heart. He gasped. His eyes flew open. Color flooded back into his lips, pink, then red, then the color of life. The room didn't go silent. The room went beyond silence. It became a vacuum. 200 people holding their breath. 200 phones still recording. Emma's sobbing stopped mid-gasp. Marcus's eyes rolled forward, found Rachel's face hovering over his. Recognition flashed across his features like lightning across dark water. His mouth moved, struggling for words, his voice barely a whisper through damaged lungs and the trauma of near death. Valkyrie. Rachel's hands froze on his chest. The color drained from her face in a way it never had when Hargrove screamed at her, when he humiliated her, when he destroyed her carefully constructed life. This was different. This was the past materializing in the present. This was a man who had seen her in a combat zone, who knew what she was, who had just spoken her call sign, the name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 5 years. Hargrove's phone was already pressed to his ear. He turned away, his voice dropping to rapid, clipped commands. Yes, this is Pastor Hargrove at Crossroads Church. I need to speak with Dr. Bancroft on the board. Immediately. No, I don't care if he's in surgery. He walked toward the sanctuary entrance, pacing like a predator assessing its territory. She's embedded in our clinic. Yes, embedded. A fake nurse with fabricated credentials. No, I'm not exaggerating. Paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, their uniforms crisp and their movements efficient. They loaded Marcus onto a stretcher with practiced precision, their eyes widening as they took in the makeshift needle decompression, the hollow pen tube still protruding from his chest, the vitals already stabilizing. One of them, a woman with gray streaking her blonde hair, looked at Rachel with something close to awe. Field medicine, she said. It wasn't a question. Rachel didn't answer. She was watching Marcus as they lifted him, watching his eyes search for her one more time before they wheeled him toward the ambulance waiting outside. His lips moved again, but no sound came out. It didn't matter. She'd heard enough. By noon, Hargrove had made 17 phone calls. By 2 o'clock, the county medical examiner had called Crossroads Church asking for Rachel's schedule and background information. By 6, he had contacted the Nevada nursing school where Rachel's credentials claimed she'd graduated in 2019, a school that had no record of her, that had no memory of her, because the military had erased every trace of her existence in their databases, buried every documentation deep in classified archives. 2 days later, when church security escorted Rachel from the building, security she'd never seen hired, directed by a pastor she'd served alongside for 4 months, Hargrove stood in the parking lot with a piece of paper in his trembling hand. The sun was brutal on the asphalt. The heat rose in waves that distorted the air like old film footage. "This is a trespass notice," he said, his voice low and controlled now, the fury replaced by something colder. "Strategic. You will never work in healthcare in Houston again. I've made certain of that. Criminal charges are being filed with the state medical board for fraud. For practicing medicine without proper authorization. For endangering patients." Rachel took the paper from his hand. She read it without expression. Her jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't waver. When she folded it and put it in her pocket, her hands were steady. "Thank you, Pastor." She drove north through the city, past the sprawl of warehouses and office parks, past the signs for Memorial Park and the exit she'd memorized over 4 months of volunteering, for months of building a life that never belonged to her. The veteran cemetery sat on a rise overlooking a small valley, the stones arranged in perfect rows like soldiers standing at attention. Her husband's grave was in Section D, row 14. She'd placed fresh flowers there the week before, white lilies, his favorite. Now the flowers were wilting, their petals browning at the edges, and she knelt on the wet grass as rain began to fall, hard and cold and indifferent. The marble was cold against her forehead. She pressed her entire face against it, breathing the smell of wet stone and earth. "I'm sorry, baby." Her voice didn't crack. It was steady and low, a voice used to delivering bad news in worse circumstances. "I tried to stay hidden like they ordered. I followed the protocols. I was invisible. And I couldn't let that kid die, and now I've failed you. Failed our promise that I'd stay safe." Rain hammered the cemetery in waves. Other visitors had left hours ago. No one came to graves in weather like this. She stayed there until the sun disappeared, soaked and shivering, her combat boots sinking into the mud, and she whispered to marble and the dead and the part of herself she'd buried along with her husband 5 years ago. That was when her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. A call from a restricted line. She didn't answer it. The restricted line stopped ringing 3 days later. By then, the FBI had already knocked on the doors of Crossroads Church at 6:51 in the morning, just as Pastor Hargrove was reviewing his press statement in the sanctuary. He drafted it carefully, strategically, positioning himself as the courageous administrator who'd exposed a dangerous imposter, who'd protected his congregation from an unqualified charlatan. The irony was that federal agents don't announce themselves before they arrest you. They simply arrive, and everything you built begins to crumble at your feet. The lead agent was named Morrison, and she had a file thick enough to require 2 hands. Hargrove's face went the color of old hospital walls when she opened it on his mahogany desk, the one that cost more than most people's cars. "Pastor Hargrove," Morrison began, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone who'd delivered this speech 100 times, "did you contact the Texas State Medical Board 6 days ago?" Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps. I reported a protocol violation. That's my duty as clinic director." His fingers gripped the desk edge, knuckles whitening. Morrison didn't blink. She pulled out documents, official-looking pages with official seals, pages with Hargrove's own signature at the bottom. "You submitted a formal complaint claiming Rachel Torres confessed to you that her nursing credentials were completely fabricated. That she admitted to lying on her temporary staffing agency application. That she acknowledged having no legitimate medical training whatsoever." The papers landed on the desk between them like evidence in a courtroom. Because they were. Hargrove's eyes darted left toward his board members, who were standing in the doorway watching this unfold. She was practicing beyond her scope. "These documents are forgeries, Pastor." Morrison's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Senior Chief Torres never made any confession to you. You fabricated evidence. You submitted it to a state regulatory agency under penalty of perjury. That's a felony. The word hung in the air like smoke. Felony. Hargrove's carefully constructed 30-year reputation, his board positions, his consulting contracts, his network of hospital administrators and medical professionals, suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. Morrison nodded to 2 federal marshals standing by the doorway, and they stepped forward. Their presence changed the entire physics of the room. "We also found emails," Morrison continued, opening another folder. 3 emails to hospital board members at Oak Creek Memorial where you claimed Rachel Torres had a history of Medicare fraud in Nevada. Completely fabricated. You contacted the county medical examiner and claimed you'd witnessed her steal controlled medications from the clinic pharmacy. Another lie. You systematically attempted to destroy her ability to work in healthcare through documented false statements. Each word was a hammer blow. Hargrove's board members exchanged glances and began backing toward the door. One of them, the one who'd sat next to him in the front pew for 17 years, just shook his head and left. "I was protecting this church," Hargrove whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. That's when General Kevin Chen walked into the sanctuary. 2 stars on his shoulder, command authority radiating from him like heat off summer asphalt, and eyes that had seen classified things and made decisions that changed lives. He moved like a man who'd never been told no, who'd led Navy SEAL teams and managed Fort Hood's entire operations, who had 600 personnel under his direct command. His brother Marcus was still in recovery at Oak Creek Memorial. His 10-year-old daughter Emma stood beside him. "My uncle wants you to know something," Emma said, her small voice echoing through the empty sanctuary with the clarity of a courtroom testimony. "The woman you fired is a senior chief petty officer." General Chen stepped closer. His voice dropped to something dangerous. "My brother told me what you said to him. That Rachel was practicing beyond her scope. That she was unqualified." He paused, and the silence stretched like a wire pulled taut. "Senior Chief Torres has more combat medical experience than half the doctors at Oak Creek Memorial. She's held together arterial wounds with her bare hands while under sniper fire in Baghdad. She's certified in emergency field trauma surgery. And you tried to have her arrested for saving his life." The words fell like a gavel. A Navy nurse from the VA Medical Center stepped forward, a file trembling slightly in her hands. She began reading, and each sentence was a nail in Hargrove's coffin. 2 tours in Baghdad, 2017 to 2019. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. Initial arrival, Bagram Airfield with 75th Ranger Medical Support Element. She turned pages. Deployed to Forward Operating Base Shank, Loga Province. Attached to Convoy Security Operations. Certified in Advanced Trauma Care, Field Surgery Protocols, and Emergency Medical Direction. Then a man in civilian clothes stepped forward, but there was something about him, the way he carried himself, the way his eyes scanned rooms like he was reading threat matrices. A SEAL team leader from Virginia Beach named Graves, and he held a leather folder embossed with a trident insignia. "Let me read her decorations for you, Pastor," Graves said, and his voice wasn't loud, but it filled the sanctuary like an amplified whisper. "Bronze Star with Valor." He let that sit for a moment, let Hargrove absorb it. "Purple Heart." Another beat. The silence was so thick you could see it, taste it. "Navy Commendation Medal." Graves closed the folder. She pulled 12 men from a burning convoy while taking shrapnel to her shoulder and leg. While her own blood was pooling on the ground. While rounds were still coming down range. "That's what your protocol violation was, Pastor. That's what you wanted to destroy her for." Morrison produced the handcuffs. They were steel, heavy, and they clicked with a sound like a lock closing on something final. "Dr. Hargrove, you're under arrest for filing false statements with a federal regulatory agency, for criminal defamation, and for obstruction of a federal witness protection protocol." The cuffs clicked onto his wrists, click, click, 2 metallic snaps that echoed through the sanctuary. He stood there, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap, his carefully maintained appearance crumbling. Morrison read him his rights in a mechanical voice while he stared at his own hands, at the handcuffs, at the reality that his 30-year career had evaporated in the time it took to read a folder aloud. The marshals led him down the center aisle, the same aisle he'd walked every Sunday, the same path he'd used to command his congregation from a position of authority. Camera flashes went off outside. Local news crews who'd been promised an exclusive about the dangerous imposter were instead recording the exposure of a fraud. His head deacon turned away. Board members were already on their phones, distancing themselves, protecting their own reputations before the ink on the arrest report dried. As they walked Hargrove toward the door, he passed the staff bulletin board where his write-up about Rachel, the disciplinary action, the formal accusation about practicing beyond her scope, still hung pinned under his signature. Someone reached up and tore it down, and the paper fell like a confession being destroyed. The sound of it ripping was almost louder than the handcuffs had been. 6 months later, Rachel Torres walked into the CPR training facility at Houston Community College. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, nothing that announced what she was. Hargrove was at the far end of the room, demonstrating chest compressions on a training dummy, showing a class of teenagers and young adults how to push down 2 inches, how to count out loud, how to save a life with their hands. He looked up and froze. She was standing in the doorway, backlit by afternoon light, and she didn't say a word. She simply walked to the check-in desk and placed something down. Worn combat boots. Desert tan, scuffed from years of terrain. Nobody in this room had walked, still stained with Baghdad dust that no amount of washing could remove. The dust of a place where she'd decided who lived and who died, where she'd held the line between chaos and order, where her hands had learned to be weapons and salvation in the same breath. She placed them on that desk the way a warrior plants a flag. The silence stretched. Hargrove's students didn't understand what they were witnessing. But Hargrove did. He understood every detail of it. Rachel held his eyes for a long moment, not in anger, not in vindication, but in the way you look at someone who's become irrelevant. Then she turned and walked next door to the free clinic she now ran. The clinic had Crossroads Community Health Center printed on the door, but it wasn't really Crossroads anymore. It was hers. It was Rachel's. Her federal protection status had been lifted after Hargrove's arrest triggered a comprehensive review with the Pentagon, the FBI, and the Department of Veterans Affairs. She was no longer Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, the ghost who had to hide. She was Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, the hero who could finally be seen. On the clinic wall hung a photograph of her in dress navy blues, her medals visible, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Navy Commendation Medal, her face younger but carrying the same quiet dignity that had always been there. Beneath it, a plaque read, Crossroads Community Health Center, Director of Emergency Medical Services. Marcus Chen was there, fully recovered, volunteering twice a week. His daughter Emma was interning during school breaks. General Chen had secured VA funding that tripled the clinic's budget and ensured it would stay open, stay staffed, stay mission-focused on the patients who needed it most. The same staff nurses who'd abandoned the break room when Rachel sat down now worked under her supervision, and Sharon, the one who'd been most coordinated in the exile, brought her coffee every morning without meeting her eyes. Rachel didn't acknowledge it. She just accepted the cup and kept moving, kept working, kept saving lives. She ran the clinic the way she'd run triage in forward operating base Shank during sandstorms that turned day into dusk, with surgical precision, with a compassion that had been forged in combat, with the unshakable knowledge that protocol served people, not the other way around. On her desk sat a framed photograph of her late husband in uniform, and sometimes, during quiet moments at 2:06 a.m. when the clinic was empty and the city outside was still, she touched it and whispered, "I made it, baby. I made it through. I'm not running anymore." Hargrove watched through the window from the parking lot as patients streamed into her clinic. Patients who had nowhere else to go, who were poor or uninsured or broken by life, and they came to her because word had spread, the woman who runs the free clinic in Houston doesn't care about protocol violations or scope of practice. She cares about whether you live or die. He understood, standing there in the parking lot where his career had become dust, that he hadn't just lost his job. He hadn't just lost his board positions or his consulting contracts or his church influence. He'd lost to a hero. He'd lost to someone he was too blind to recognize, too arrogant to respect, too small to understand. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you've made it this far, you already know this story deserves to be shared. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the unsung warriors among us, the ones whose real strength is invisible until the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. Like this video, comment below with your thoughts, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Because sometimes the person you underestimate most is the one who saves your life.